If you've been feeling like the world is becoming a more dangerous, less peaceful place, well, that's not just a feeling. It's a measurable reality, and it's backed by some pretty stark data. So let's dive in and really try to understand what's going on. All right, first things first, let's look at the hard numbers. This is what paints the real picture of our current global landscape, and it shows a really clear downward trend when it comes to global peace. And this graph, well, it gets right to the heart of the issue. This data, from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, it shows a really dramatic trend. The number of active conflicts around the world isn't just a little high, it's at its highest point since the end of World War II. This isn't some small blip, it's the peak of a long, troubling climb. And just to put a fine point on it, the latest Global Peace Index counts 59 active state-based conflicts. That is the highest number we have seen in the modern era. And remember, each one of those numbers, that's a crisis, a region in turmoil, and real people caught right in the middle of it all.
So, okay, we know what is happening. There's more conflict. But the much bigger, more complicated question is why? Why is this happening now? Well, experts are starting to frame this troubling new era with a new name, the New World Disorder.
The International Rescue Committee breaks this New World Disorder down into three key features. First off, you have more global and regional powers all competing for influence. Second, those old long-term strategic alliances, they're being replaced by these constantly shifting, really unpredictable partnerships. And third, the way countries interact is changing. It's way less about cooperation and following the rules, and a lot more about short-term, power-based deals. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. The data totally backs it up. The Institute for Economics and Peace calls it geopolitical fragmentation. Just look at these numbers. The count of influential countries has absolutely exploded. More and more nations are getting involved in conflicts outside their own borders. And civil wars are increasingly becoming these international proxy wars. And that, of course, makes them way more complex and so much harder to solve. This quote, it really hits home, doesn't it? It captures the human cost of all this disorder. Just as the need for aid is skyrocketing in these crisis zones, the global support system, the funding, the political will to help is actually shrinking. It's a perfect storm, and it's leaving millions and millions of people incredibly vulnerable. So this New World Disorder isn't just some abstract concept. It has a very real, very painful footprint on the ground. In the 2026 Emergency Watchlist, they pinpoint the exact countries where all these dangerous trends are coming together and creating potential catastrophes. Here it is, the International Rescue Committee's 2026 Emergency Watchlist. It identifies these 20 countries as being at the absolute greatest risk of a new or worsening humanitarian crisis. You can see right away the geographic concentration of that risk, especially across Africa and the Middle East. That's where the impacts of this new global fragility are being felt the most. And the impact of what's happening in just these 20 countries, it's absolutely staggering. I mean, think about this. They represent only about 12% of the world's population, but they account for this massively disproportionate share of global suffering. We're talking almost 90% of all humanitarian need and 80% of all displaced people on the planet. And the IRC isn't alone in sounding this alarm. You can see it when we compare their watch list with one from ACLED. That's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. Now, their focus is slightly different. One's on humanitarian crises, the other's on armed conflict. But there is a clear expert consensus here. You see names like Sudan, Syria, and Myanmar showing up as major hotspots for both. It really highlights this strong overlap in where the world's worst crises are unfolding. Okay, so we know where the hotspots are. But what is it that pushes a really tense situation over the edge and turns it into a full-blown catastrophe? Let's break down the key factors that actually drive that escalation. This is the critical question, right? For anyone involved in conflict prevention, for diplomats, for aid workers, understanding these running signs is the crucial first step toward maybe, just maybe, stopping that escalation before it's too late. The Institute for Economics and Peace points to a few key things that act like gasoline on a fire. You've got external military support pouring in, you have economic incentives to keep fighting over resources, the exploitation of old ethnic divisions, and a weak or fragmented government. All of these can act as accelerants, turning what might have been a manageable conflict into an intractable, devastating war. And here's the really grim result of this new, more complex era of conflict. Our ability to actually resolve these wars is collapsing. I mean, look at this. In the 1970s, nearly a quarter of all conflicts ended with a peace agreement. By the 2010s, that number had plummeted to just 4%. We are getting worse, not better, at making peace. So with all these conflicts getting harder and harder to solve, and crises just piling on top of each other, what does the future of war even look like? This brings us to a really sobering and, I think, critical question about the very nature of modern conflict itself. What makes today's crises so incredibly difficult is that they rarely happen in a vacuum. This image from Ninja really illustrates it. You often have these layers of crises: climate disasters, extreme poverty, political instability, all feeding off each other. So with that in mind, let's look at Sudan as a kind of case study for where this trend might be headed. According to analysis from the Middle East Eye, the war in Sudan it's transforming. It's no longer just a failure of diplomacy. What's happening is that the armed groups have created a self-sustaining system, a whole war economy, where the conflict itself provides the political power, the resources, and the military structure they need to survive.
And that leads to this absolutely chilling conclusion. When war becomes the system, the entire incentive structure just flips on its head. Suddenly, for those in power, it becomes more dangerous and way less profitable to actually make peace than it is to simply keep the war going.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative question. In this new world disorder, where conflicts are so complex and internationalized and self-sustaining, are we quietly shifting our expectations? Is the world starting to give up on actually resolving these crises and instead settling for merely managing them as if they're just a permanent state of affairs? That is definitely something to think about.